I would like to invite Dr. Shana McLean to further discuss the satellite imagery in the climate and environmental crisis context. And now the floor is for you, Shana. I will share my screen for your presentation.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Justin. It's a pleasure to be able to participate in this meeting today. I look forward to everyone's questions and the discussion following. And I'm also excited to see Jeffrey's presentation as well. Hopefully we don't overlap too much, and instead really tell an integrated story of what we could be doing here. Because truthfully, when I was approached about presenting on conflict, migration, and climate change, and the role that Earth observations play here, I thought, wow, this could take like a month. Like there's so much to do, so much to cover here. So I'm going to give a very broad overview of what this looks like, how I approach conflict and migration, environmental change and climate change, specifically from an Earth observation perspective at NASA. So let's see, before I start, I was asked to just briefly give a little introduction about myself. So as Justin mentioned, I'm Shana McLean. I'm the Disasters Program Manager at NASA. I work within the Earth Sciences Division. So there's a whole collective of us that are looking at how to advance science for the benefit of society globally. And today I'm going to be talking about the issues that I mentioned, specifically how Earth observations are not only critical for issues like conflict and migration and environmental and climate change, but how we can be using Earth observations in a way to better understand factors that drive fragility, or in other words, prevent us from becoming more resilient as a society. Before I think I've started with NASA about 7 years ago, maybe just a tad less than that. And really my role has been to guide the future of disaster science towards an improved understanding of risk. And I would say that this is really systemic risk, because I often find that people are very comfortable looking at one part of our changing world, but it's really how these things are interconnected and work together that determine how we're going to change the future in a more sustainable and resilient way. There's a nexus that happens between the human dimension and our changing environment that drives both our lives and livelihoods, but also how our lives and livelihoods change and impact the environment, and therefore climate change. And prior to NASA, I worked for a number of years for the United Nations, specifically for a specialized unit but that was managed jointly between the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, UNOCHA, and UNEP, the Environment Program, where we focus largely on issues of environmental emergencies, including technological, radiological, and industrial disasters and accidents. But we also looked very closely at how to better integrate considerations for the environment into humanitarian action. And so when disasters and crises occur, we understand that natural resources largely have a critical role to play in this sphere, and yet they're often removed from the policy and programming of humanitarian contexts, which can lead to an erosion of vulnerability over time. And so this, combined with my work at NASA and also work I've done probably for the last 2 decades or so with the Environmental Law Institute supporting programming on conflict and environmental peace building and migration and displacement, are all the different elements that I'm going to draw from and shape what I talk with all of you about today. So Justin, turn to the first slide, please. And let's see. This graphic isn't going to blow you away, but it's definitely interesting. So for more than 100 years, we've been measuring and monitoring changes here on Earth. And we have recorded these different changes in terms of temperature, loss of land, changes in the atmosphere, just changes in multiple things around the world. For many of these years, temperature records, as you can see over time in the graphic displayed, remain stable. And this was largely as, people around the world were changing and evolving, but not had yet made the leap to the Industrial Revolution, which for many, and certainly for our climate, marked a giant leap for us, not only, in terms of our own evolution, but also a giant leap in the contribution of pollutants to the atmosphere. And so even with, I guess, is it stopped, Justin, or is it just delayed? Oh, I guess it's like maybe lagging. It's okay. So it said, oh, here we go. Well, I guess we'll get it's like we get it in pulses. So anyways, in any case, what we're seeing here is that while you see certain leaps in evolution and different changes in the, for us, you're also seeing increases in the number of degrees that our world, our global climate is warming. And so even with certain pulses and temperature changes, we see relative stability. But in the last several decades, we've been making such major leaps in terms of technology development, which requires mining of resources, land degradation, and overall degradation of multiple resources in the environment. We're growing exponentially as a population, which places additional demand on resources in terms of food, health products, et cetera. All of these result in greater emissions. And so in order to make room for people, we're removing the last remaining containers of carbon that are helping to regulate our changing world. And so I think, unfortunately, maybe you can just jump to the end of the play button, Justin, so people can get an understanding of how this was 1980. And if you get us to where we are now, then you see that we've grown exponentially just in the last 40 years. And so next slide, please. And so what does this mean in practice? It means that we're seeing exponential increases in the amount of carbon dioxide and the amount of methane that we're releasing into the atmosphere. We're seeing a reduction in the amount of sea ice and ice sheets. This is not only leading to an increase in the sea level, increasing our ocean levels, leading to flooding, loss of coastal and island areas, and more, but we're also seeing a tremendous amount of warming of our oceans. And this alters the regulation of our climate and can lead to more frequent and intense weather and violent disasters. Next slide, please. But underpinning all of this change really is that's taking place between so underpinning all of these changes that are happening around the world with regard to climate change is really this very specific connection that's happening between humans and their environment. And so what we know about conflict is first that natural resources are one of the primary contributors to conflict. They can fuel armed conflict, so things that start as social disagreements can lead, can rapidly devolve into armed situations that create protracted crises over time. And they can also, natural resources can also be used as a weapon of war. This means that combatants realize, sometimes more than many of us, the innate value of natural resources so much that they intentionally burn crops in forested areas, destroy water infrastructure, and bomb oil supplies in order to disrupt the ability of communities to access their resources and defend themselves. Conflict over natural resources largely occurs because the resources are not equitably being shared across populations. They're being damaged or polluted as we mine, deforest, degrade land, or because we're degrading the land to the extent that the resources are no longer providing essential provisioning services to the communities. If managed sustainably and equitably with improved governance, natural resources can also directly contribute to post-conflict peace building and to averting war. Next slide, please. And so the environment here not only plays a role in conflict, but also in migration. We know that there is rarely ever one single reason why people make the decision to migrate, assuming that they're actually given the chance to be able to make the decision to move, which many are not. But we do know that while we hear terms like climate migration and climate migrants, or also climate refugees, the root causes of migration are often most prominently driven by economic and social factors. People want to have better jobs, better education, and improved quality of life. Degraded security conditions and environmental factors largely linked to the same issues I mentioned as contributors for conflict, such as inequitable sharing of resources, right, resource degradation, et cetera. These all contribute to reasons for migration because this leads to diminishing health conditions, insecure livelihoods, and significant insecurity. In fact, it's understood that the change in our global environment will be one of the leading drivers of migration between now and 2050, causing somewhere between 500 and 700 million people to move worldwide. And that can include both internal migration as well as international migration, which is why the numbers are so large. Next slide, please. So what does this look like in practice, and where on Earth do your Earth observations play a role in all of this in terms of conflict, migration, and environmental climate change? One of the major changes we see contributing to insecurity is our degrading landscape and changes in land use and land cover. Desertification is a type of land degradation that we're seeing increasingly contribute to fragility. And nearly 41% of the Earth's land surface is considered dryland areas, which is where desertification occurs. So these areas are home to nearly 2 billion people, many of whom are living in fragile contexts, including poor health conditions and economic insecurity. And the changes in these lands lead to short-term and irregular migration, where herders and farmers are moving constantly in search of land for their livelihoods. Understanding desertification, the extent of its impact, and how it's changing over time is something we can do with the use of satellite information. So using tools like the Global Precipitation Measurement and vegetation indices from MODIS, we can better understand how availability of water and rainfall for precipitation for crops, but also in terms of drought, are decreasing or are increasing over time, and how this then leads to changes in vegetation cover. These help us understand largely or ultimately changes in crop production, extent of drought periods, and much more. Next slide, please. Rapid deforestation is another factor that contributes to issues of conflict and migration, as forested areas often provide important livelihoods to communities, including building materials, firewood, forest products, and a lot more. However, poverty, instability, and competition over these resources, as well as lack of enforcement, as many of you are aware, of these, like really enforcing and protecting these areas, this often contributes directly to rapid deforestation. And so with deforestation, we have Landsat. We have multiple satellites that could contribute to our improved understanding of deforestation. But I would say that Landsat satellite, which you see in the upper right corner, it holds one of the longest living catalogs visualizing environmental and global change across the world. We've been running the Landsat satellites in partnership with the United States Geological Survey since 1972, and have collected millions of images of our changing world, which enable us to see how we have altered our natural landscape exponentially over time. In fact, Google, who often uptakes imagery from across multiple space agencies and different private sector and commercial satellite interests, have automated Landsat imagery recently in their time-lapse function, which allows you to rapidly watch landscapes change right in front of you. And so imagery like this is critical not only for seeing the changes happen over time, understanding the extent, but also being able to project future potential loss as a result of the change that we're seeing, either increasing or decreasing over time. But it can also be used in concert with other types of information that can yield information regarding increases or decreases in carbon sequestration, loss of the resource for communities, but also ultimately how this is impacting climate change over time. Next slide, please. And then similar to degradation of land and forested resources, we're also seeing these same changes occur with our shared water resources. As we're all aware, water is life, right? It's a central element that really keeps us thriving as a society. And it's one of the most valuable resources on Earth, not only for us, but in terms of conflict and what's driving migration. So water management and sharing of water resources can be contentious, and can often lead to challenges with infrastructure that includes poor sanitation, pollution, and eventually conflict over who has access to water and who has the rights to use the water. In fact, I think we've seen recently with many places around the world, but certainly with the Russian-Ukraine conflict, that water infrastructure can be one of the first things damaged in conflict in order to cut people off from critical resources. So given the importance of water, there are a tremendous number of satellites around the world that exist. There are also in situ systems that help us take both the Earth observing satellites with ground-based data that regularly monitor and measure water availability and water stress around the world. We have systems that can measure surface water, precipitation and transpiration, soil moisture, and groundwater, which really gives us a holistic understanding of the water system globally. And so here in the lower left corner, we're using our gray satellite data, which helps us understand the different types of water stress that's experienced around the world. Next slide, please. And while there are a number of natural hazards around the world, we can also see that the hazards driven by hydrometeorological changes are exacerbated exponentially by climate change. And so, as mentioned in the very beginning, our oceans are warming, we're changing the landscape of our world, and this is leading to the increased frequency, intensity, and impact of storms, cyclones, tornadoes, and more. And so we can measure using a variety of instruments from satellites. We can measure the changes in thermal signatures of our oceans, of cyclonic storms, and therefore understand not only how things are changing in this small scale, like as a hurricane is moving, how it's gaining intensity, or a cyclone is moving and gaining intensity towards a region over time, but we can also see large scale changes in what this means in terms of future potential impact to communities as climate changes. Next slide. And then finally, none of this would be possible if we weren't thinking about all of us and the role that we have to play in the changes that are taking place across the world. And so here we see imagery from Black Marble, which allows us to see changing land use patterns, changing human activities, and the dynamics of infrastructure that are changing over time, where places are being built, where they're collapsing overnight, where people have, after people have been displaced, we can see illegal mining operations take form. And so we can see when the lights are on, when they're off, and then for how long they're off, which can also help us understand stress or sustainability of communities around the world. Next slide. And so with this, I'm going to come to a close. I'll just say that because we understand the changes that we're making to the environment and how these changes are driving climate change, and that these combined changes are contributing to conflict and migration, we also now know how to use the science that can measure these changes over time, and ideally use the science in ways that inform policy decisions, legal decisions about how we not only manage our resources, including environmental considerations about policy options, but how we can also work towards improved mitigation of climate change. So it's not enough to understand how things are changing. We need to be able to use science to inform policy and advance policies and decision making in the way that really makes a difference, so that we're not seeing increasing movements towards migration and conflict. With that, I'm going to close. Thanks so much for your time. Justin, back over to you.
Thank you, Shayna. Thank you, Shayna, for your amazing presentation. And it's very exciting and learn about your insights and into the application of your work and satellite imagery in these kind of critical situations from conflict, migration, and deforestation. And I believe these are not only just crucial, but it's also very fascinating and like measuring the changes through the pictures from the outside of the Earth. And yeah, and it's intriguing how, to learn how these technologies play a significant role in our rapidly changing world in terms of climate change. And thanks so much for your insights. And please, if you have any questions to Shayna about this presentation or her work or her presentation, please just leave a question in the chat box, and we will have a Q&A session after Geoffrey's presentation later on. And again, thank you, Shayna. And now let's welcome to our next speaker, Geoffrey. He will share his experiences on how community mapping is leveraged in responding to climate and environmental crisis, with specific examples of from his work in the African region. Now the floor is for you, Geoffrey. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Justin, and it's really a pleasure being here and sharing with everyone. Yeah, so like Justin mentioned, I'm Geoffrey Kategan. I work as the Community Projects Lead at the Humanitarian OpenStreetMap team. And really in this presentation, I'm going to be going about how community mapping can be used to address climate challenges that we face today. And just a brief outline of what we are going to cover. We'll be talking about OpenStreetMap and how that is being used as a tool for community mapping. But also we'll go and have a look at exactly how local communities and climate change kind of are related. But also we'll give some case studies and success stories of how this is being done in different communities across Africa. Yeah, but before I jump into that, just a little bit about HOT. HOT is the Humanitarian OpenStreetMap team, and we are an international team that is dedicated to humanitarian action and community development through open mapping. So we are really working towards a world where community needs are addressed through mapping, and also a world where everyone can access and contribute to the map. But also we are working towards a world where open map data is available and can be used for impact. So what is community mapping? We can briefly define community mapping as a collaborative approach, which involves local residents mapping their own areas and their own resources and things that really concern them. And I know there are very many approaches for mapping, but why community mapping? Why is community mapping important? So with community mapping, residents, we believe, have a deep understanding of where they live, including cultural, historical, and environmental aspects. And through mapping, they can really represent these perspectives on the map. But also they have unique insights into community assets, needs, and vulnerabilities, some of which are caused by climate change. But also ownership and empowerment. Through mapping and putting this data on the map, they're empowered to bring change to their communities and also to be more resilient. So through community mapping, can have more accurate and really relevant data that reflects local realities. And this can really enhance community resilience through informing decision change. So through open mapping, can create data that can inform decision making. And really the mapping methodology for community mapping, you can break it down into about 4 steps. So one, we get the local knowledge of where to map, but also what to put on the map. And then secondly, we do what we call remote mapping. So that's when we get volunteers and community members, give them access to satellite imagery that they can use to digitize and create data out of. But also the other bit is field data collection, where data can be collected to provide more useful information of those things or those features that cannot be mapped, got from remote mapping. And then the last stage is really making map products out of this data so that this data can be used for decision making. So how does it really, this is where now OpenStreetMap works on. Like I mentioned, open mapping and community mapping can be, done using different tools. Someone may use paper, but when you use paper, maybe that data is going to remain in your local office, in your local village. So there's need for a global platform that is openly available, where this data can be put. So through community mapping, a lot of knowledge can really be put in an open platform. So OpenStreetMap is really a collaborative project to create a free and editable map of the world. And it's really a map that anyone can contribute to, but also use the data because the data is really openly available. So as you can see in this image, this is, it's a global map. But if you zoom in, then you can go and see the level of detail. This is all openly available data. But also if you find something that is missing, it's a matter of you going in and editing and making that change. Again, this is how it works. You have remote mapping where you have access to satellite imagery, and you can trace and digitize that information into vector data that can be read by machines. But also, you have what we call mobile mapping. So we have several mapping applications that you can download on your phone, and you can now add more detailed information on the map. For example, it might be someone might have mapped a building on satellite imagery, but then someone on the ground can really identify what that building is. Is it residential? Is it a commercial building? Is it a school? So the outcome is really citizen-generated ground truth data that is available freely and openly in OpenStreetMap. And just to show you a little bit about one of the editors that we use, this is called the ID editor. And the way it works is that, you go to OpenStreetMap. This is how the map looks like before putting the satellite imagery. So there is some missing information. But when you go to the editing mode, then you can simply add the satellite imagery from the background settings that you can use to do the mapping. So once you zoom in, then you can find the things that have not yet been mapped, and then you can digitize them. And when you're doing this, you're really creating data that can be life-saving in terms of, let us say, disaster response, but also for disaster preparedness. Data is critical and important for decision-making. Okay, so with OpenStreetMap, we have community engagement. This is a map that shows, the map before and then after. So this is when the satellite remote mapping is done. But now we are seeing more details added by individuals on the ground by adding more local data through community and mapping. So they are sharing their local knowledge, and they're mapping community assets and putting them on the map. So it's really community-driven data collection for specific needs. So it's these people who live in these areas that identify what is missing on the map and what would they like to map. But also, they can do that through participation in mapping events that we call mapathons. And this is where everyone really comes together to complete a map of a particular place that's to make it more detailed. So just a simple snapshot here to show you some key statistics. OpenStreetMap has over 8.7 million users, making over 4.5 million map changes daily. So it's a huge database with over 1,500 gigabytes of data, which is openly available and is from community contributions. But coming back to climate resilience, how can we really harness this local knowledge to make sure that communities are more resilient to the effects of climate change? So we all know that climate change affects people everywhere in different parts of the world, but also we know that some parts of the world are even more vulnerable than the other. And very many times, it's these areas that are more vulnerable that you find are missing on the map. They're not mapped. You find very many people living on the place, but when you zoom in on the map, you may find it's blank. And we know extreme weather events like flooding and sea rise are really straining individuals that live in these areas. They impact livelihoods, agriculture, water resources, health, and everything. But what can citizens do, to become more resilient to these effects? Okay, and that's where, community mapping for climate and environmental crisis comes in. And there are two ways we can really do it. One would be through anticipatory response mapping. And this is where the mapping is done proactively to identify and plan for potential hazards or disasters and crises. So through anticipatory mapping, we are anticipating and preparing for risks before they occur. So there's no, here we're not waiting for, for disasters to occur before we can, map. We are really anticipating where the disasters are likely to happen and going in and making that map data available to allow for more effective and timely responses. But also, as we know, very many places are not yet mapped. And sometimes the only mapping that you can do is to respond to a disaster through disaster response mapping. So here we are creating map data to aid in planning, coordinating, and executing of responses to natural or human-made disasters. But also this information is given to NGOs, responders, governments to provide critical information and also to the affected communities. So I just want to quickly share some few case studies from around Africa where OpenStreetMap has been used by local communities in conjunction with the Red Cross to combat the effects of climate change. So the first example I want to give is from Kenya, Wajir County. So this was a project that was done by the Kenya Red Cross in collaboration with the Open Mapping Hub for Eastern and Southern Africa. So the Wajir County is really an area that characterized by it's kind of arid and semi-arid region, which makes it susceptible to climate-related disasters such as droughts and floods. So through community mapping, people were able to map up-to-date data on building, roads, but also key infrastructure that was defined by these community members. So this helped them to increase their understanding of the risks that they face and the vulnerabilities and what capacity they have to respond to these risks. But also it fostered the use of data-driven decision-making through the use of data for a proactive response to disasters. And yeah, from the data that they created some nice dashboards like this one that you can see is showing, 290 boreholes in their place, 209 of them are functional. So they can really, through community mapping, this is already data that can be used for advocacy to make sure that there is improved services. And still on the same dashboard, you can see more information, like how many households, what power sources do they use, which organizations work in their area. So this is the power of community mapping, because with this information, then it can be used to make the community more resilient. And communities are, contributing to data that is informing like decision making. So they are empowered. The other example I'd like to give is from Malawi, which is in Southern Africa. And this is the Malawi Red Cross, also working with the OpenStreetMap community in Malawi to respond to the disasters that happened due to the cyclone that happened, that is Storm Anna, and that affected the area. So through community mapping, they were able to assist in the recovery efforts, because when disaster agencies go to these areas, they need data to use to know how many people are affected, where are they, where are the damaged buildings, where are the damaged roads. And through community mapping, this data is made available. Again, working with these communities that were affected by these disasters. The final example I'd like to give is from Uganda. And again, this is a collaboration between the Uganda Red Cross and the OpenStreetMap Uganda community to respond to disaster efforts in the country. So they have like a very good working relationship. Whenever there is a disaster, then they work together to provide data that supports on the disaster recovery. The image that you see on the right is a mudslide that happened in the southwestern part of the country in solo, and there was need like to take, for example, drone imagery to assess the damage, and also look at the pre-disaster imagery and see how many houses have been washed away, how many people are likely to be affected. And this is data that's needed like really very fast, because people are affected and they need help. But also they did mapping when there was the Ebola outbreak in 2022 to map the 3 districts that were affected. And they provided this information to the Ministry of Health that helped it in contact tracing to find and make sure that the outbreak is controlled very quickly before it spreads further. So yeah, in a nutshell, that's what I wanted to cover. And yeah, I just want to encourage everyone on the call, please contribute to mapping, find a mapping community near you, and you know, create a map of your area and make sure that yeah, where you live, the community is more resilient to the effects of climate change. Thank you, and back to you, Justin.
Thanks, Jeffrey. You can stop sharing screen. Yes, thank you so much, Jeffrey, for your engaging presentation. It's truly exciting to see the impact of community mapping in tackling environmental challenges, particularly in the African context. And I believe that the community engagement is quite important and can be a key factor to leverage community mapping technology in the communities as well. And I also want to know more about the how the data literacy in the community level can also leverage this technology. And maybe we have around 15-20 minutes Q&A session, and so we can definitely ask more about the community mapping to Jeffrey. But before we go to the we go to the Q&A session, I have a question for both of you speakers, and just I'm just curious, like personally, like your views. So the question is, in the coming years, what do you each see as the key challenge and the most exciting opportunity of this this technology, like harnessing satellites and community mapping for climate action? That's the question, and maybe whoever is ready, you can go first. Yes.
I'll go first. That's fine. Can you still hear me, Justin? My Zoom
Yes.
popped out for a
Yes.
second. Okay. So you know, I think the exciting thing maybe is that you know that everything that we're doing, whether it's, you know, what NASA as a space agency or other space agencies are doing, what Jeffrey and Hot OSM and others are doing in the community mapping sphere, these are all evolving over time. Our science is getting better. The things that we understand about what's, you know, the changes that are taking place at the global scale, but also at the local scale, I think, you know, this is advancing, and so is with it, I think, this movement towards more science-informed decision-making, which just absolutely thrills me, given, you know, especially in parts, well, in the United States, but in elsewhere around the world, we've seen a lot of reticence regarding the connection and benefit of science to society. And so to me, I think as we see more people adopting these practices, advancing the technology, the more likely we are really to build the resilient communities that Jeffrey spoke about. You know, I think the challenges are that as our technologies evolve and the different capabilities evolve, we haven't really figured out yet how to still integrate things in a more systemic manner, meaning that, you know, we can see global change, like how, you know, how deforestation or land cover land use is changing, how water supplies are depleting, but we're not harmonizing it or automating it in ways that help us understand then what those local impacts, you know, that Jeffrey's mentioning really are, so that we can get ahead of these events. You know, I think that there's still a lot to be done in terms of improving modeled capabilities, improving prediction, improving our ability to develop the thresholds that trigger different actions, so that we're not just responding to disasters and crises events as they occur, but are instead responding to the different adaptive approaches that we need to take to get ahead of events. And so, you know, I'm hoping that we start to advance there more. And I'm always excited for opportunities where you see people of diverse backgrounds and, you know, different scales of like looking at these challenges coming together to find solutions, which is why I think a webinar like this is so important. But it really takes us working together and taking a more integrated approach, I think, to really change the needle in a direction that's going to influence, you know, our changing environment, our changing, you know, climate, and then also how our lives and livelihoods are then impacted as a result. Those are my thoughts.
Thanks so much, Shayna. And Jeffrey?
Yeah, yeah. Thanks, Shana, for sharing those thoughts. I think in terms of like mapping, for me, I think the challenge is that, you know, very many parts of the world remain unmapped. They're missing on the map. And when you look at, you know, the rate of the mapping, it will take us like a long time, you know, to make sure, you know, everyone is on the map. But the opportunity is, but also which has also like a challenge, is that AI is catching up. Nowadays, there is, you know, AI that can digitize buildings. So the example that I was showing, which I was doing like manually to trace a building, then now like AI that can detect these objects. But the challenge is that also the algorithm that were used for this AI are at a global scale. So how a building looks like in the UK is not the same way the building looks like in Uganda. So if you use like that to try and predict things at a global level, the data quality is not going to be very good. So it is an opportunity because then we can use AI to make sure that we can map faster. But again, it's not yet there. It's not yet as good as enough to be that it can predict things in everywhere. So I think the thing is that even with technology, it also has to be localized. So if AI is, you know, detecting building, then it should be doing so at a local level, not at a global level. So that, yeah, if we can use AI to do the, you know, the digitization, then maybe people who live in these areas can now focus on adding that more detailed information that is more critical for decision making. So at least we kind of like move and cover a gap using the technology. So yeah, the technology is improving day by day, but I think there is still some work that needs to be done. Yeah.
Yes, thanks for your answer. Yeah, as Shayna mentioned, the science-informed decision making, I think in terms of the decision making, even in the humanitarian action, the importance of science and the mapping system is also getting really, the importance of this is bigger and bigger. And in the sense, we agree with you, definitely. We need more capacity and learning opportunity like this to learn more and to learn how to approach this new technology to apply to our local context and in terms of humanitarian action. And yes, we had a question to Shayna. I know Shayna, you're more in the disaster management field, but one of our audience asked the question: hasn't the Earth climate changed before? And does the ozone layer have anything to do in the climate change? Maybe if you don't mind, yeah.
Sure. So yes, I mean, I think, well, had the visualization worked effectively, I think you would see that the change has been happening over a long period. It's just that there have been pulses towards warming that ended up regulating over time. And what we've been seeing since the 80s is that instead of having that ebb and flow of changes, we're now seeing a steady increase without reducing back to normal or average climate over time. And so that's the reason. I mean, this is why you see all of the reports from, you know, the IPCC and from others talking about tipping points and where we're headed if we don't change some of the problems that we've created, you know, around the world. I would say that, you know, so the question was, is the ozone hole related? Is that, hold on, let me look real quick. Sorry. Ozone layer. Okay. Yes and no. The ozone, the ozone, there was a hole created in the ozone, like by us decades ago, but also decades ago, around the 1980s, I believe, or so. You'd have to look it up to be specific in what year. A lot of international attention was taken to what was creating that. And so there were international agreements towards deciding to reduce the amount of chlorofluorocarbons in the atmosphere, CFCs, which has led to an increased recovery of the ozone over time. And so you'll actually see, if you go, we have NASA is known as one of the United States' premier climate agencies. And so we have a climate change program that's dedicated to showing, you know, how you can see the ozone healing over time. Of course, this, and, you know, has a lot of importance when it comes to how much radiation from the sun is being, you know, absorbed or radiated back. But because that's healing, it's only one part of like what I would say is a much larger consideration when it comes to climate change. And so what we're really looking at now is the fact that we're losing forests, which are now not carbon sinks, but now carbon contributors to the atmosphere. We're losing, you know, the ice sheets, which are changing the temperatures of our ocean and the circulation patterns with the temperature. And so it's all of these elements, along with other pollutants that are coming from, you know, methane, carbon dioxide, et cetera, that are really starting to drive a lot of the change that you see now. And I'll put a link to our climate change website in the chat in case anyone's interested in learning more.
Thanks so much for your clear answer. Actually, this question was also, I was also wondering about this question, because when we think about NASA, we always wonder, like, and we always think of climate and climate change and like ozone layer, how the climate has changed over time. And yeah, again, I thank you for your answers again. And Jeffrey, yeah, I think one of your colleagues answered to a question, but I think it's a very good question for other audience, and also for just in case we share this recording to our network later on. And I think this question is very important as well. So the question is there any requirement or knowledge to start doing community mapping? Yes, and also on top of that, I wanted to ask you, like the engagement strategy with the local community. I think the community mapping, the key part is community engagement. And how do you approach the community engagement as well? Maybe, yes, the floor is for you. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Justin. And it's good to see several mappers also joining the call. Thank you for sharing all those links in the chat on how to get started. Thank you, Heather and Maria. And yeah, I think, yeah, one thing that is really great or that is common, I think there is someone speaking, I think. Dean, if you can mute. So yeah, I was saying that one of the thing that is really common between Horton and Justin maybe needs to mute that person.
Jabulo, can you go mute? Thank you.
Okay. All right, thank you. I think I can continue now. So yeah, I was just mentioning that, yeah, there are very many good resources on how to get started mapping, and the resources have been shared in the chat. Yeah, the learning curve is not really that high, but I think the opportunity that mapping gives you is that you can volunteer anywhere. So I can be in Uganda and volunteer to map for Morocco if it is affected by an earthquake. So that's kind of one good thing. So there is like mapping tasks on the hot tasking manager. Again, the link is in the chat where you can go and find mapping projects that you can contribute on. But also just to touch quickly on your question, Justin, like how do we do community engagement through the Humanitarian OpenStreetMap team? I think what we really try to do at HOT is to be a catalyst for community mapping. We know people want to map places where they live, but sometimes they have blockers and they need support. So, of course, we provide the tools. Most of our tools are open source tools, like the hot tasking manager that everyone can use for mapping. But in addition to that, we have now what we call regional hubs. So have regional open mapping hubs to try to get closer to these mapping communities and local communities and, facilitate things like maybe mapping grants, trainings, to remove those small challenges that they face. Yes, they want to contribute, but then they need some support. And of course, we also have partnerships with other organizations, for example, through the Missing Maps network, of which even the Red Cross is part of. So all these kind of different initiatives help us to engage. But the best one is the Mapathon, have several mapping events that happen, which is like a nice way for people to get together to map. Because when you do it alone, you can get bored. But when you do it with other people, then mapping is more enjoyable. So that's a little bit of how we do the community engagement. And back to you, Justin.
Thank you. Thank you, Jeffrey. Since we don't have much time, but let's move on to the next question very quick. To Shayna. Actually, this question is, I received this question privately. So I wonder how we can deal with the people that are still like the denier and hypocrisy related to the climate crisis. How does NASA assure that the scientific knowledge reaches this society if it's hardly really taken into account in the recent governments? I can copy and paste this in the chat box.
Justin, that's in the chat?
Oh, no, it's to my privately. I received it privately, so. Yes, I just copy and paste it. Yeah.
Okay. Related to climate crisis, how do NASA show the scientific knowledge of society? Okay, that's a big question. Part one, how can we deal with people that are still in denial about climate crisis? There's a well understood, I think, principle about the adoption of things like science and technology, where there's a certain percentage of the population that just are never going to change their mind no matter what you do. While others may be more early adopters, they may not fully understand, but they're willing to listen. Those that are kind of gung-ho and, ready to change, and those who are just all in no matter what. So if you see it as a spectrum, what I tend to think about is those who are really on the early adopter to all in kind of spectrum, because there's only a very small percentage that really are focused on denying wholeheartedly that it exists at all, or maybe similarly or complementary, dedicated to maybe understanding that it does exist, but want to provide misinformation and disinformation in relation to its existence to serve their own purposes. And so traditionally, we understand that those are people that you will never be able to make a difference with. And so the best thing we can do is to find those that are receptive and interested. I think that's one element. The other is that sometimes people don't understand how exactly something like global climate change is impacting them directly. And so the ability to share stories that are more meaningful to the things that they care about most often drive change in ways that are often unexpected. I talk to my family a lot who aren't really huge climate, they're not climate deniers, but I have a lot of like challenges talking about climate change with them. But they love fishing and hiking and things in nature. And if we don't, if I'm able to tell them stories about how, ineffective policies or laws or, denying that climate change exists will detract and degrade the resources that they value most, I make a lot of headway in ways that I would not had I just yelled at them about how climate change is real. And so, I think foundationally, understanding that there's a group of people that you'll just never make any changes with, but then trying to, maybe meet people where they are and understand that element is one way of approaching it. How NASA ensures that science reaches society, I think, is in a variety of ways. So we're a grant making institution. So the grants that we give to academic communities, to practitioner communities, to private and commercial sectors are helping advance the work that they do around the world. This integrates Earth information or science information and Earth observations, but it does it through the people that are doing work around the world, so that NASA is not doing the work. We're simply we're the science behind some of the work that's being done. We also do a lot to interact with communities, create educational and training capabilities. So for those of you who are interested in learning more about how to use some of the processing and analysis capabilities that I mentioned across my presentation, going to NASA RSET, which is our Applied Remote Sensing Training program. I can put the link in the chat, is another way to get people to learn how to do some of these capabilities, or at least understand the connection between what we see changing around the world and the changes that are impacting people. And then finally, I think NASA tends to be something that's well understood or well known around the world. And so we use our voice, I think, in ways that help communicate our changing Earth in a variety of ways, including through our Earth Information Center. And I can put a link in the chat for that as well, in case people are interested in learning more about all the work that we're doing around the world. And I would say just really quickly, there was someone who asked about communities, and we do a phenomenal amount of work, just a really heavily concentrated amount of work directly with communities. But I'll put a link into our programmatic website so you can learn about some of the communities that we're working with around the world. Thanks so much. And Justin, one real quick thing before I turn it back to you. We've had a few questions about getting the presentations of myself and Jeffrey to the people. Is this a possibility that you could maybe tell everyone about before we close?
Sure. Do you mind sharing your presentation file with the audience? Is it okay for you, or?
Yeah,
yes.
It's very okay. Yes.
Then I can coordinate this. Just please, you all can visit the Facebook group, the Volunteers Red Cross Red Crescent, even though we failed to live stream today. But I will write a note. I will write an announcement and with my email address, or feel free to contact my email address. I will leave the address at the end of this session. And actually, we have time's up, so I think this will be the last question for both of you. And I just received the message from one of the participants. Hi, I am a youth volunteer from Madagascar, and I've been a Red Cross volunteer for 5 years, and I believe that our volunteering can help community to become more resilient. My question is, community mapping and satellite imagery are sometimes perceived as highly technical and distinct from humanitarian efforts. How can we bridge this gap and overcome these barriers to integrate these tools more effectively into humanitarian action? I think maybe to wrap this session up, maybe Shana and Jeffrey, you can also add some messages to the youth volunteers of the Red Cross Red Crescent, since they have a full potential and passion to learn more about the new technology like this. Yes, maybe Jeffrey, you can go first, I think.
Yeah, sure. That's a wonderful question. So I think one thing with mapping with OpenStreetMap, I think is like a good way to to learn about GIS and mapping, because the learning curve is not really that steep. And in every country, in most countries, there is like always an open mapping community. So for example, in Madagascar, there is a group called OpenStreetMap Madagascar. And they normally have like mapping events and trainings that anyone can join and learn how to map. But also there are some that we organize that are online that again are open for everyone to join. So yeah, I can say, yeah, that it's really not very hard to learn how to map. And also there are online resources that anyone can, just quickly read through and get up to speed to mapping. And one last thing is that also you can also map using your phone. We all like, using our phones. And for example, there's a link that was shared in the chat called Map Swipe. But just touching your screen, you're also contributing to mapping in some way. So yeah, there are different tools with different kind of skills required, but it's not really hard to learn. But with yeah, because I think there is like I've mentioned, Justin, there is a huge volunteer base within the Red Crescent movement. Would also love if they can also join us to map, because yeah, there is still a lot of unmapped places, and the more hands we get, the better. So yeah, looking forward to connect. And if anyone has any questions, also reach out, and I'll be happy to help. Also leave my my email in the chat. Thank you.
And Shayna, as a final remark of this session.
Sure. So I did put some resources in the chat. I think RSET is one way of learning some of the complexities of processing data that's coming from satellite and Earth observing systems. We also have a new consortium that I launched recently called NASA Lifelines. It's managed by Dev Global, and it's really dedicated to building a movement so that we get more people integrated from the humanitarian sector and from those interested in mapping and the Earth observing system sector, more working together so we can build capacities, improve, how people are doing this in the future. And so I think maybe just to build off what Jeffrey said, there's so many people out there that are interested in this. This is a growing interest. This is exciting. And so I think just being able to lower the barriers, getting more people involved and building a community of people doing this, I think is something that you're helping support with this webinar here today. And similar to Jeffrey, if anyone has any additional questions, please reach out to me, but also learn more about nasalifelines.org in the chat if interested. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Shayna, and thank you, Jeffrey, for your time and contribution and amazing conversation today. And lastly, to wrap this session up, the IFRS Sovereign Academy, we are soon launching the Limitless Youth Innovation Academy. Basically, Limitless is coming back very soon. And if you guys are interested in technology, also youth-led innovation, and interested in implementing your creative ideas to the local solutions to tackle the only one challenge, climate and environmental crisis, please stay tuned. Stay tuned with us. You can simply visit our website, Surfing Academy, and also follow our social media and subscribe to our YouTube channel, Surfing Voices. And again, I just want to thank you so much to Jeffrey and Shayna for today's session. And as a Red Cross Red Crescent network and volunteers and staff members, we learned so many things today. And hopefully, all we can go back to our community and apply to this apply these technology to our local community context to collectively combat the climate and environmental crisis. I think we have 5 minutes over, but thank you so much, everybody, for joining today. And stay tuned, and I will share the recording file on the YouTube channel as well.